The unexpected arrival. Ethan Walker was a quiet man. Living alone in his small apartment on the outskirts of the city, he enjoyed a life of solitude, surrounded by his gadgets and books. But deep down, he felt lonely. One day, while browsing online, he stumbled upon an ad that promised a smart pet, a revolutionary AI companion that could learn, adapt, and keep him company. It seemed perfect, exactly what he needed to add some spark to his dull life. The order was placed, and Ethan waited eagerly. The delivery date arrived, and as the doorbell rang, he felt an odd sense of excitement. A large, heavy crate was waiting for him at his doorstep. It was much bigger than he expected for a pet. The label on the crate read, "Handle with care. Special contents inside." Ethan dragged the crate into his living room, curiosity building. With a small crowbar, he pried the crate open. At first, he expected to see some sleek robotic device, maybe shaped like a dog or a cat. Instead, he froze. His breath caught in his throat. Inside the crate was a young alien girl. She looked fragile and scared. Her skin was a soft shade of blue, shimmering slightly under the light. Her large, glowing eyes darted around the room, filled with fear. Her long silver hair was messy, and she clutched a thin blanket around her small frame as if it was her only shield. She didn't look older than 16 or 17 in human years, though her features were undeniably alien. Ethan stumbled backward, almost dropping the crowbar. What the? This has to be some kind of mistake. The girl flinched at his voice, pressing herself against the back of the crate. Her body trembled as if she was terrified of him. Ethan's heart sank. She wasn't just scared. She looked desperate, like someone who had been through something horrible. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. "Hey, it's okay," he said softly, kneeling down to her level. "I'm not going to hurt you. I don't know why you're here." The girl didn't respond. She just stared at him, clutching the blanket tighter. Ethan noticed a small metallic collar around her neck. It had strange symbols etched into it, symbols he couldn't understand. There was also a tag attached to the collar with a single word written in English, "Leela." "Leela," he repeated, testing the name. Her ears twitched slightly at the sound, but she didn't speak. Ethan sat back, running his hands through his hair. This wasn't what he signed up for. He wanted a smart pet. Not this. Where had she come from? Who sent her? And why? As Ethan tried to make sense of the situation, he noticed a folded note inside the crate. Picking it up, he unfolded it carefully. The note was written in shaky handwriting. "She is not safe where she came from. She needs you. Please protect her. Do not let them take her back." Ethan's stomach churned. Not safe. Who is they? He muttered to himself. He looked back at Leela, who was now watching him cautiously, her glowing eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. He realized she didn't have much time left in that crate. Her thin frame and pale complexion hinted at exhaustion and starvation. "All right," he said aloud, trying to sound calm for her sake. "First things first. Let's get you out of there." Ethan extended a hand, moving slowly so he wouldn't startle her. At first, Leela didn't move, but after a long moment, she hesitantly reached out, her delicate fingers brushing against his. Her hand was cold, and Ethan couldn't help but feel a pang of pity. Whatever had happened to her, it hadn't been good. Carefully, he helped her out of the crate. She stumbled slightly, her legs weak, but Ethan caught her before she could fall. She flinched at his touch but didn't pull away. Up close, he noticed faint bruises on her arms and a scar running across her left cheek. Someone had hurt her. Ethan led her to the couch and wrapped a blanket around her. She sat there silently, her glowing eyes scanning the room as if trying to understand where she was. Ethan knelt in front of her, his voice gentle. "Leela, is that your name?" he asked. She blinked but didn't respond. Ethan sighed. "Do you understand me?" This time, she nodded. It was a small, hesitant nod, but it was something. Ethan felt a small spark of relief. Good, he said softly. Can you tell me where you're from, or who sent you here? Leela didn't answer. Instead, tears welled up in her eyes. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she whispered one sentence, her voice shaky and filled with fear. Don't let them take me back. Ethan's heart pounded. Whoever they were, Lila was terrified of them. He didn't know what to do, but one thing was clear. She needed help. His life had just gotten a lot more complicated, and he had no idea what he was getting himself into. But as Leela looked at him with those pleading eyes, he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't turn his back on her. Learning to trust. Ethan couldn't sleep. The events of the day replayed in his mind like a broken record. The alien girl, Leela, was now in his home. Curled up on the couch, her body still trembling even as she tried to rest. She had barely eaten, taking only a few cautious bites of the sandwich he'd made for her. Every sound, every shadow in the room, made her flinch as if expecting danger to leap out at her. Ethan sat in his chair, watching her from a distance. He didn't know what to do next. His plan to call the authorities had been thrown out the window the moment she'd whispered those desperate words. Don't let them take me back. That fear in her voice had been raw, unfiltered, and it stuck with him. Whoever they were, Ethan knew they weren't coming with good intentions. The quiet hum of his computer pulled him out of his thoughts. On impulse, he began searching for anything that could explain what was happening. He scanned forums, news articles, and obscure websites, but there was nothing about an alien girl matching Leela's description. No missing cargo, no government experiments, nothing. It was as if she didn't exist. His frustration grew. Finally, he turned his attention back to Leela. She was awake now, sitting upright, her glowing eyes scanning the room. Ethan approached slowly, careful not to startle her. Hey, he said gently, sitting on the coffee table in front of her. Are you okay? She stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, after a moment, she gave the smallest of nods. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I need to know more, he said, keeping his voice soft. I don't know who sent you or why, but if I'm going to help you, I need answers. Can you tell me anything? Where you came from? Who's after you? Leela's gaze dropped to her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. For a long time, she didn't speak. Ethan thought she wouldn't answer at all, but then, in a barely audible voice, she said, Far away. Another world. Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that made Ethan's chest tighten. Another world, he repeated, trying to keep his tone steady. Are you running from someone? Did they hurt you? Her hands trembled. She nodded again, her movements slow and hesitant. Ethan could see the fear returning to her eyes, and he regretted pushing too hard. It's okay, he said quickly, raising his hands in a calming gesture. You don't have to talk about it if you're not ready. Leela looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. They want me because of what I know, she whispered. But if they find me, they'll destroy me. Ethan frowned. What do you mean, what you know? What could be so important that they'd? He trailed off, realizing he might not want to know the answer. But Leela didn't elaborate. She simply hugged her knees to her chest, her small frame looking even more fragile than before. Ethan sat back, running a hand through his hair. None of this made sense. An alien girl, a cryptic warning, and now some vague, looming threat. He felt like he'd stepped into the middle of a sci-fi thriller he hadn't signed up for. Yet, as impossible as it all seemed, Lila's fear was real. That much he was sure of. All right, he said finally, breaking the silence. I don't know what's going on, but I promise I won't let anyone hurt you. You're safe here. Leela looked at him, her eyes widening slightly. For the first time since she arrived, she didn't look terrified. There was something else there now, a flicker of hope. Ethan decided to change the subject. Do you understand how things work here? On Earth, I mean. Leela hesitated before shaking her head. I know some things. I learned from them. Her voice wavered, and Ethan didn't press her for details. Instead, he stood and walked over to his kitchen, grabbing a glass of water and some crackers. "Here," he said, placing them in front of her. "You need to eat something." She stared at the crackers like they were an alien concept themselves. Slowly, she picked one up and nibbled on the edge. Ethan couldn't help but chuckle. "It's not poison, I promise." Leela glanced at him, and to his surprise, her lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile. It was fleeting, but it was there. Ethan felt a strange warmth in his chest. For the first time, he saw her not as a strange creature dropped into his life, but as someone who desperately needed help. The moment was interrupted by a sudden noise outside, a car door slamming. Leela froze, her eyes darting to the window. Ethan tensed, his instincts kicking in. He moved quickly to the door, peering through the peephole. A man in a dark suit was standing by a sleek black car, scanning the building with a cold, calculating gaze. Ethan's blood ran cold. "They found us," Leela whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan turned to her, his heart pounding. "Stay here," he said firmly. "Don't make a sound." As he stepped toward the door, a thought echoed in his mind. Whoever this man was, he wasn't here for a friendly chat, and Ethan had no idea how far he'd have to go to protect Leila, but he knew he couldn't let her down. The quiet life he once knew was over, and there was no turning back. The hunt begins. The air in Ethan's apartment was heavy with tension. Leila sat curled up in the corner of the room, her glowing eyes fixed on the door, as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. Ethan, on the other hand, paced restlessly, glancing between the window and the door. His mind raced with questions. Who were these people hunting Leila? And why had they come so quickly? The sound of footsteps in the hallway made his heart stop. A soft knock followed, deliberate and rhythmic. Ethan froze. His instincts screamed at him not to answer, but ignoring it might make things worse. Lila's grip on the blanket tightened as her glowing eyes darted toward him. Ethan took a deep breath, motioning for Leila to stay quiet. He approached the door, peering through the peephole. A man in a dark suit stood there, holding a clipboard. His face was cold and expressionless, his eyes sharp and calculating. He looked professional, but something about him felt wrong. "Mr. Walker," the man called out, his voice calm but unnervingly firm. "I'm here on behalf of the Companion Retrieval Agency. There seems to have been a mix-up with your recent purchase." Ethan's heart raced. Companion Retrieval Agency. He'd never heard of such a thing. The man didn't wait for a reply and continued, "I understand you received an unauthorized product. We're here to take care of the issue. Open the door, and we can resolve this quickly." Ethan clenched his fists, his mind spinning. This wasn't a mix-up. It was a hunt. They knew Leila was here, and they weren't leaving without her. "I think you have the wrong address," Ethan called back, trying to keep his voice steady. The man's smile was faint, almost amused. "We don't make mistakes, Mr. Walker. I suggest you open the door. Things will go much smoother if you cooperate." Ethan glanced back at Leila, who was trembling, her eyes begging him not to let them in. His jaw tightened. Whoever these people were, they weren't getting her. "Sorry, I can't help you," Ethan said, his voice firmer now. The man sighed, his calm demeanor slipping. "Mr. Walker, don't make this difficult. If you won't open the door, we'll have to take more direct measures." As soon as he said it, Ethan heard the faint hum of something mechanical outside the window. He rushed to look and spotted a drone hovering just beyond the glass, its camera lens focused directly on him. "Leila," he whispered, panic creeping into his voice. "We need to move. Now." Leila stood, her legs shaky but determined. Ethan grabbed his backpack, stuffing it with essentials, food, water, and his laptop. He didn't have a plan, but staying here wasn't an option. A loud thud made him spin around. The man outside was no longer knocking. He was trying to force the door open. Ethan cursed under his breath, pulling Layla toward the back exit. "We'll have to take the fire escape," he said, his voice low. Leela followed him without question, her small frame moving silently. As they climbed out onto the rusty fire escape, Ethan heard the sound of the front door breaking open. The men had entered the apartment. "They're gone," one of them said. "Check the building. They couldn't have gotten far." Ethan and Leela descended the fire escape as quickly and quietly as they could. The cold night air bit at their skin, but neither of them complained. They reached the ground and slipped into the shadows of the alley. Ethan led Leela through the maze of back streets, his heart pounding with every step. He could hear the faint buzz of drones above, searching for them. Leela kept close, her glowing eyes scanning their surroundings. Finally, they reached an old, abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. Ethan pushed open the rusted door, ushering Leela inside. The space was cold and empty, but it would have to do for now. As Ethan locked the door behind them, he turned to Leela. "We're safe for now, but they're not going to stop looking. You need to tell me everything. Who they are, why they're after you. I need to know what we're dealing with." Leela hesitated, her hands twisting nervously. She took a deep breath and finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "They're called the Syndicate. They control worlds, entire civilizations. I escaped from them." Ethan frowned. "Why you? What makes you so important to them?" Leela looked away, her eyes filled with guilt. "I wasn't just a slave to them. I was an experiment. They put something in me, something valuable. They want it back." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of experiment? Before Leela could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed outside the warehouse. Ethan's stomach dropped. They'd been found. He grabbed Leela's hand, his voice firm. "We're not safe here. We need to keep moving." As they slipped out through a side door, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The hunt had started, and whoever the Syndicate was, they weren't going to stop until they had Leela. And whatever secret she carried. Secrets of the alien girl. The warehouse was dark and cold, its emptiness amplifying every tiny sound. Ethan stood near a broken window, peering outside for any sign of pursuit. The night was quiet, but he knew better than to trust it. The Syndicate was relentless. If they wanted Leela, they'd stop at nothing. Behind him, Leela sat on the dusty floor, hugging her knees to her chest. Her glowing eyes dimmed with exhaustion, but her mind was far from calm. Ethan could feel her tension, her unspoken fear filling the air like a storm about to break. "We can't keep running blind," Ethan said, turning to face her. "I need to know what we're up against. You keep saying they want something from you. What is it? Why are they hunting you?" Leela hesitated, her fingers gripping the fabric of her torn dress. Her gaze flickered to Ethan, and for the first time, she seemed to wrestle with a decision. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're hunting me because I escaped with something they can't afford to lose. Something they built but couldn't control." Ethan crouched down in front of her, his brows furrowed. "What do you mean? What did they build?" Leela's hands trembled as she pressed them against her chest. "Me." Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "You? What do you mean, you?" She took a deep breath, her words spilling out like a flood she could no longer hold back. "I wasn't just a slave, Ethan. The Syndicate experiments on people, aliens, humans, anyone they can get their hands on. They're trying to create the perfect soldier, one who can think, adapt, and fight better than any machine or living being. I'm one of their prototypes. But I wasn't perfect. I rebelled. I ran." Ethan stared at her, his mind racing to process what she was saying. "You're saying they engineered you? That you're some kind of weapon?" Leela nodded, her voice breaking. "They call us vessels. Each one of us was designed to carry something, a piece of technology, a program, a weapon. In me, they embedded a blueprint for something dangerous. What kind of blueprint? Ethan asked, his voice tight. Leela hesitated, her glowing eyes meeting his. A weapon that can destroy entire planets. It's stored in my DNA. That's why they want me back. If they get me, they'll extract it and use it. And if they can't, she swallowed hard. They'll kill me to make sure no one else gets it. Ethan leaned back, running a hand through his hair. The weight of her words pressed down on him. This wasn't just about protecting her anymore. If what she said was true, the Syndicate wasn't just a threat to her. It was a threat to the entire galaxy. We have to destroy it, Ethan said firmly. The blueprint. If it's in your DNA, there has to be a way to get rid of it without hurting you. Leela shook her head. It's not that simple. The Syndicate didn't leave any way to safely remove it. If we try, it could kill me. And even if we succeed, they'll still come after us. They don't leave loose ends. Ethan felt a surge of frustration. Every step forward seemed to reveal a deeper pit. But as he looked at Leela, her small frame trembling under the weight of her burden, he felt a renewed sense of resolve. Then we'll make sure they don't get the chance, he said, his voice steady. We'll stay ahead of them, find someone who can help. There has to be someone out there who knows how to deal with this. Leela's eyes filled with uncertainty. You don't understand how powerful they are, Ethan. They have spies everywhere. They control entire systems. You don't even know what you're getting yourself into. Ethan knelt beside her, his expression calm but determined. Maybe I don't, but I know one thing. I'm not letting them take you. Whatever it takes, we'll figure this out. Together. For a moment, Leela just stared at him, as if searching for some hidden motive, but all she found was sincerity. Slowly, she nodded, her shoulders relaxing just a little. Before they could say more, a sharp sound cut through the silence. It was faint but distinct, the hum of a drone. Ethan's head snapped toward the window, his heart racing. They're here, he muttered. Leela stood quickly, her glowing eyes scanning the shadows. We have to move. Ethan grabbed his backpack and motioned for her to follow. They slipped out through a side door, sticking to the shadows as they navigated the back alleys. The drones buzzed overhead, their searchlights sweeping across the streets. As they ran, Leela suddenly stopped, her body tensing. Ethan turned to her, confused. What's wrong? Leela's gaze was locked on a symbol spray-painted on a nearby wall, a circle with intersecting lines, almost like a compass. Her face paled. They're marking the area, she whispered. They know we're close. Ethan cursed under his breath. They were running out of options, but as he looked at Leela, he saw something new in her expression, not just fear, but determination. They think they can corner us, she said, her voice steady despite the tension. But they don't know what I'm capable of. If they want me, they'll have to fight for it. Ethan felt a chill at her words, but he couldn't help but admire her courage. Whatever was coming, they'd face it together. The hunt wasn't over, but Leela was no longer just a victim. She was ready to fight back. The pursuit. The abandoned subway tunnel was pitch black, save for the faint blue glow of Leela's eyes. Ethan's flashlight flickered as he led her deeper into the maze of crumbling walls and rusted tracks. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the faint echoes of their footsteps. Behind them, the sound of drones buzzed faintly, growing louder with each passing moment. They're closing in, Leela whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of Ethan's heart. Ethan stopped, turning to face her. He was out of breath, but his resolve hadn't wavered. We can't stop now. If they catch us here, we're done. Leela nodded, but her glowing eyes betrayed her exhaustion. Her alien physiology was remarkable, but even she had limits. Ethan could see the weight of fear and fatigue pressing down on her. Still, she followed without complaint, trusting him in a way that surprised even him. As they moved through the tunnels, Ethan's mind raced. They had been on the run for days now, evading the Syndicate's relentless pursuit. The drones, the operatives, the surveillance, they seemed to be everywhere. He didn't know how much longer they could keep this up. Suddenly, a faint vibration beneath their feet made Ethan stop in his tracks. He pressed his hand against the cold tunnel wall, his eyes narrowing. "What is it?" Leela asked, her voice tense. Ethan hesitated, his instincts screaming at him. "It's them. They've sensed something bigger." Before Leela could respond, a deep mechanical growl echoed through the tunnel. The ground trembled as a set of red lights appeared in the distance, cutting through the darkness like glowing eyes. "They've deployed a crawler," Leela said, her voice filled with dread. Ethan didn't need to ask what that meant. The sound alone was enough to tell him it wasn't friendly. "Run," he said, grabbing Layla's hand and pulling her forward. They sprinted through the tunnel, the crawler's growl growing louder behind them. Ethan glanced back and caught a glimpse of it. A hulking, spider-like machine with sharp limbs and a mounted searchlight. It moved unnervingly fast, its claws sparking against the rails as it chased them. "Do you have any tricks up your sleeve?" Ethan shouted over the noise, his grip tightening on her hand. Leela's breathing was labored, but her eyes were sharp. "If we can get some distance, I can disable it. But I need time." Ethan cursed under his breath. Time was the one thing they didn't have. Up ahead, the tunnel split into two paths. Without hesitation, Ethan veered left, pulling Layla with him. The crawler hesitated at the fork for only a moment before resuming its pursuit. Its searchlight swept across the walls, illuminating their path. Ethan spotted an old maintenance room to the side and shoved the door open. He pushed Leela inside and slammed the door behind them. The room was small, filled with rusted tools and broken equipment. "Can you do it now?" Ethan asked, his voice urgent. Leela nodded, already focusing. She placed her hands on the metal wall, her fingers glowing faintly. The air around her seemed to hum with energy. "What are you doing?" Ethan asked, watching her with a mix of awe and concern. "I'm hacking into the crawler's systems," she said, her voice strained. "It's partially organic, built with neural tech. I can disrupt its control network." Ethan didn't fully understand, but he trusted her. The hum grew louder, and Layla's glow intensified. Outside, the crawler's growl suddenly faltered, replaced by a strange metallic screech. "It's working," Leela said, though her voice was shaky. Sweat beaded on her brow as she concentrated. Ethan peered through a crack in the door, watching as the crawler stumbled, its movements becoming erratic. It slammed into the tunnel wall, sparks flying as it tried to regain control. But then, something unexpected happened. The crawler froze, its red lights dimming. For a moment, Ethan thought they had won. Then the lights flared back to life, brighter than before. Leela gasped, pulling her hands back as if burned. "What happened?" Ethan asked, rushing to her side. "They've reinforced its systems," she said, her voice shaking. "It's adapting to my interference. I can't stop it alone." Ethan's jaw tightened. He couldn't let this be the end. Then we'll have to slow it down another way. He grabbed a rusted wrench from the wall and opened the door, stepping into the tunnel. "Ethan, no," Leela shouted, but he ignored her. The crawler's searchlight snapped to him, and it began to advance. Ethan's hand shook as he gripped the wrench, but he forced himself to stand his ground. "Come on, you oversized tin can," he muttered under his breath. As the crawler lunged, Ethan threw the wrench with all his strength. It struck one of the machine's sensors, causing it to spark violently. The crawler faltered, giving Ethan just enough time to dive out of the way. Leela appeared in the doorway, her glowing hands raised. "Get back," she shouted. Ethan scrambled to his feet as Leela unleashed a pulse of energy. It struck the crawler, causing it to convulse and collapse in a shower of sparks. The tunnel fell silent, save for their ragged breathing. "Nice shot," Ethan said, his voice shaky as he leaned against the wall. Leela looked at him, her expression a mixture of relief and frustration. "You could have been killed." Ethan shrugged, managing a weak smile. "We're still alive, aren't we?" Leela shook her head, but there was a faint smile on her lips. For a moment, the tension between them eased. But deep down, they both knew this wasn't the end. The syndicate wouldn't stop. And the next time, it wouldn't just be a crawler. As they prepared to move again, Ethan glanced at Leela. "We'll figure this out," he said firmly. "No matter what it takes." Leela nodded, her eyes glowing with determination. Together. And with that, they disappeared into the shadows, the pursuit far from over. Sacrifice and betrayal. The safe house was silent, the air thick with tension. It had been hours since Ethan and Leela escaped the crawler, and now they hid in an old, abandoned bunker deep in the forest. The walls were damp, and the faint hum of dying lights was the only sound. Ethan was on edge, pacing back and forth as Leela sat cross-legged on the cold floor, her glowing eyes focused on nothing. "Something feels off," Ethan muttered, glancing at the sealed steel door. He had locked it, reinforced it, and even blocked it with old crates, but the unease in his gut wouldn't go away. Leela tilted her head toward him. "You think they'll find us?" Ethan paused, looking at her. "They always do. But that's not what's bothering me." Leela frowned. "Then what is?" He shook his head. "I don't know. It's just this place. It was too easy to find. Like someone wanted us to come here." Before Leela could respond, a faint knock echoed through the bunker. Both of them froze. "Ethan," Leela whispered, her voice trembling. "They're here." Ethan grabbed the only weapon they had, a battered crowbar, and gestured for her to stay behind him. The knocking grew louder, more deliberate. "Walker," a familiar voice called from the other side of the door. Ethan's blood ran cold. It was Marcus, an old acquaintance, and one of the few people Ethan trusted. "What the hell are you doing here?" Ethan shouted, his grip tightening on the crowbar. Marcus's voice was calm but firm. "I followed the syndicate's trail, found this place before they did. Open the door, Ethan. We don't have much time." Ethan hesitated, his mind racing. He hadn't seen Marcus in years, not since their military days. Could it really be him? And if so, why now? "It's a trap," Leela said quietly, her voice cutting through his thoughts. Ethan glanced at her. "You don't know that." "Yes, I do," she insisted, her glowing eyes sharp. "The syndicate doesn't need to break down doors when they can use people to do it for them." The knocking stopped, replaced by silence. Ethan's pulse quickened. "Ethan," Marcus called again, his tone softer now. "You're in over your head, man. Let me help you. You don't know what she's carrying, what it'll cost you to protect her." Leela flinched at the words, her gaze dropping to the floor. Ethan clenched his jaw. "If you're really here to help, tell me, how did you find us?" There was a long pause. Then Marcus sighed. "I didn't. They did." Before Ethan could react, an explosion shook the bunker. The steel door blew inward, slamming into the wall with a deafening crash. Ethan was thrown backward, hitting the ground hard. Smoke and dust filled the air as syndicate operatives poured into the room, their weapons trained on Ethan and Leela. Leela scrambled to her feet, her hands glowing with energy. Ethan tried to reach her, but two operatives grabbed him, pinning him to the floor. "Don't fight them," Marcus shouted, stepping into the room. His face was calm, but there was guilt in his eyes. "Ethan, stop. You'll only make it worse." Ethan glared at him, fury boiling in his chest. "You sold us out." Marcus looked away, his jaw tightening. "I didn't have a choice. The syndicate doesn't ask, they take." "They'll take her and kill us both," Ethan shouted. Marcus didn't respond. Instead, he nodded to the operatives. "Secure the girl." Leela backed against the wall, her glowing hands sparking with raw energy. "Don't touch me," she screamed, her voice trembling but defiant. One of the operatives stepped closer, raising the containment device, a cylindrical capsule designed to trap and neutralize her abilities. Lila's eyes darted to Ethan, desperation etched across her face. "Leela, don't give up," Ethan yelled, struggling against his captors. Leela's gaze hardened, With a sudden burst of energy, she unleashed a pulse that knocked the operatives back. The capsule clattered to the ground, its containment field flickering out. Ethan used the distraction to elbow one of the men holding him, freeing himself. He lunged for Marcus, grabbing him by the collar. "You betrayed me," Ethan roared, his voice filled with rage. Marcus didn't fight back. "It was the only way to keep you alive, Ethan," he shouted. "Do you think you can outrun them forever? This was never going to end well." Ethan shoved him away, his hands trembling. "You're pathetic." Before Marcus could respond, another team of operatives entered the bunker. This time, they carried heavier weapons, designed for one purpose: capturing Layla. "Ethan!" Leela screamed as one of the operatives raised a weapon aimed directly at her. Time seemed to slow. Ethan saw the fear in her eyes, the hopelessness of their situation. He couldn't let them take her. Not like this. With a burst of adrenaline, Ethan grabbed the discarded containment capsule and hurled it at the operatives. It exploded on impact, releasing a shockwave that sent them sprawling. "Run!" Ethan shouted at Leela, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the bunker's back exit. They sprinted through the narrow corridors, the sound of pursuit close behind. As they reached the surface, Leela slowed, her glowing eyes filled with tears. "Ethan, I can't keep running," she said, her voice breaking. "They'll never stop." Ethan turned to her, his expression fierce. "Then we'll make them stop, no matter what it takes." For a moment, Leela hesitated, but as she looked into Ethan's determined eyes, she nodded. The betrayal burned fresh in Ethan's mind, but it had also steeled his resolve. They might be outnumbered and outgunned, but he wasn't going to let the syndicate win. Not today. Not ever. The final stand. The syndicate's headquarters loomed in the distance, a towering fortress of steel and glass that pierced the night sky. From their vantage point on the ridge, Ethan and Leela could see the flickering glow of the compound's defenses. Drones circling like vultures, armed guards patrolling the perimeter, and electric barriers humming with deadly energy. "This is suicide," Ethan muttered, adjusting the makeshift armor strapped to his chest. His face was grim, but his eyes burned with determination. Leela crouched beside him, her glowing hands tracing the dirt as she mapped out their plan in the soil. "If we don't go now, they'll come for us. And next time, we won't escape." Ethan exhaled sharply, glancing at her. She looked fragile, her silver hair tousled, and her alien features weary from days of running. But her eyes, they were fierce, burning with a resolve that had grown stronger with each step they'd taken together. I don't want you to get hurt," Ethan admitted, his voice softening. Leela looked at him, her glowing eyes steady. "I've been running my whole life, Ethan. If I don't fight now, I'll never be free. Neither will anyone else." Ethan nodded, his grip tightening on the stolen syndicate rifle. "All right then. Let's end this." The plan was simple, but the odds were impossible. Lila would disable the fortress's defenses using her unique connection to the syndicate's technology, while Ethan provided cover. They had one chance to break into the central control tower, where the syndicate stored the data that tied Lila's DNA to the weapon. If they could destroy it, the syndicate would lose their leverage over her, and perhaps over countless others like her. They moved quickly, slipping through the shadows of the outer perimeter. Leela extended her glowing hand toward a nearby drone. With a flicker of energy, its lights dimmed, and it crashed silently to the ground. "That's one down," Ethan whispered, his voice tight. Leela glanced at him. "We'll need more time to take out the central systems. Once we're inside, it won't be quiet anymore." Ethan smirked, raising his rifle. "I wasn't planning on being quiet." They reached the first barrier, a shimmering electric field that buzzed ominously. Leela placed her hands on the control panel beside it, her fingers glowing brighter as she hacked into the system. Sparks flew, and the barrier flickered out of existence. "Go," she urged, motioning for Ethan to move. As they sprinted across the open ground, Alarms suddenly blared. Spotlights swept across the yard, and the sound of boots thundered against the metal floors of the compound. "They'd found us," Ethan shouted, raising his rifle and firing at the approaching guards. The shots were precise, dropping one guard after another, but more kept coming. Leela ducked behind cover, her hands glowing as she sent an electromagnetic pulse toward the guards' weapons. Sparks flew, and their rifles short-circuited, leaving them defenseless. "We're close," Leela called, pointing toward the central tower. Ethan nodded, covering her as they pushed forward. Bullets ricocheted off the walls, and explosions shook the ground beneath their feet. But they didn't stop. They couldn't stop. Inside the tower, the air was colder, sterile, and filled with a faint hum of machinery. The walls were lined with monitors displaying streams of data. Lila's steps faltered as they reached the central console, her gaze locking onto a massive screen that showed a diagram of her DNA. "That's it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "That's the blueprint." Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her. "You can do this, Leela. We've come too far to turn back now." Leela nodded, stepping forward. Her hands hovered over the console, glowing brighter as she began to interface with the system. Lines of code shifted and scrambled under her command. Suddenly, the room was flooded with red light. A deep mechanical voice boomed through the speakers. "Unauthorized access detected. Activating fail-safe protocols." Doors slammed shut, and the hum of approaching drones filled the air. Ethan cursed, turning to face the incoming threat. "Leela, how much longer?" "I'm almost there," she cried, her voice trained as she fought against the system's countermeasures. The first drone burst into the room, its weapons locking onto Leela. Ethan fired, the rifle's sharp crack echoing in the enclosed space. The drone exploded, but two more followed close behind. "I can't hold them off forever," Ethan shouted, taking cover behind a console. "I just need a few more seconds," Leela yelled, sweat dripping down her face as her glowing hands worked furiously. The drones swarmed, their weapons firing in rapid bursts. Ethan's ammo ran dry, and he resorted to grabbing a fallen guard's sidearm. Each shot felt heavier, each second longer, but he didn't stop. Finally, Leela screamed, her hands blazing with light as she delivered the final command. The central console erupted in sparks, and the diagram on the screen dissolved into static. "It's done," she gasped, collapsing to her knees. Ethan rushed to her side, pulling her up. "Then let's get out of here." But before they could move, the central monitor flickered back to life. A figure appeared on the screen, a tall, shadowy man with piercing eyes. "You think you've won," the figure said, his voice dripping with disdain. "This is only the beginning. You may have destroyed the blueprint, but you can't erase what's in her." Leela's eyes widened. "No, you're lying." The figure smirked. "We don't need the data. You are the weapon." The room began to shake as the tower's self-destruct sequence activated. Ethan grabbed Leela's hand, pulling her toward the exit. "We're leaving now." They sprinted through the collapsing tower, the walls crumbling around them. Explosions rocked the compound as they barely made it to the forest's edge before the entire structure went up in flames. Ethan and Leela collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. The fortress was gone, but the weight of the figure's words lingered. "You're not a weapon," Ethan said firmly, looking at Leela. "You're more than what they made you, and we'll prove it." Leela's glowing eyes softened, and for the first time, a small, genuine smile crossed her lips. The syndicate might not be finished, but neither were they. Together, they would face whatever came next.